Hello, and again, welcome to the Northeast Florida Environment Summit. My name's Catherine. I'm proudly the Public Relations Chair for the Environmental Law Society here at Florida Coastal, and I'm proud to introduce you to our Climate Change and Public Policy panel. We have Professor Kevin Leske from Barry University School of Law, and we have Dr. Lynn Ringenberg from University of South Florida. We're going to start with Professor Kevin Leske. Professor Leske is an associate professor of law at Barry University School of Law. His principal expertise is in environmental law, including air and water pollution, climate change, and land use. He's also an expert in the administrative law, constitutional law, civil procedure, and appellate advocacy. His published works and presentations cover areas such as the Clean Air Act, climate change regulation and litigation, preemption, federalism, and U.S. Supreme Court practice. He previously held academic positions as a visiting scholar at Vermont Law School and as a fellow at Harvard Law School. Prior to entering academia, Professor Leske served as an Assistant Attorney General of Vermont, where he focused primarily on national air pollution and global warming cases. His work also included arguing Vermont's Supreme Court appeals in land use cases and environmental law enforcement actions. In addition, he served as a U.S. Supreme Court Fellow for the National Association of Attorneys General in Washington, D.C., where he helped to prepare state attorneys for their upcoming oral arguments, edited Supreme Court briefs, and prepared an amicus brief in a pending case. Before joining the Vermont Attorney General's office, also represented the province of Ontario, Canada, in Clean Air Act cases in federal courts of appeals and before the U.S. Supreme Court. Professor Leske is admitted to the practice of law in the state of Vermont, where he is inactive, as well as before the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 9th, and D.C. districts.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Professor Hull and the rest of the planning committee here as someone who's in the midst of planning their own environmental summit. I can appreciate how much work goes into putting on a production at a summit like this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity here to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and it should be to yours, and that's climate change, or as it's also known, climate disruption. I'm excited to be joined here, and together we're going to be talking about the public health, argue on climate change and the public health. To summarize, as the latest National Climate Assessment reported, which I'll talk about later, climate change presents a global health problem. Health effects include premature deaths related to extreme weather events, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, waterborne illness and infectious diseases, and even threats to mental health. And these impacts manifest themselves in different ways. We'll encounter new threats in the future, while some existing threats will become more intense. And like a lot of other environmental problems, these risks are not shared equally. And the time really is already upon us to adapt and to mitigate. And we've already cleared some of the hurdles, but there's still quite a bit of work to do. And so with that quick introduction, let me turn to the three main areas I'm going to cover in this presentation. Because everyone has heard or is familiar with climate change as a general concept, I'm just going to spend just a few minutes on the background and the evolving science concerning the concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And by no means will this be authoritative. It's just really a launching point to talk about the associated health impacts that are predicted. And as I'm sure you realize, we could spend an entire time here today talking about a topic like that. Next, I'll briefly talk about the legal framework for regulation. And by this I mean the regulation of GHGs to address climate change here in the U.S. To be sure, climate change is a global problem that is going to take a global effort, but for the purposes of today, I'll just confine my remarks to the U.S. legal system and the Federal Clean Air Act. And I do this because it should be no surprise that the trigger for regulation of GHGs here is rooted in its public health impacts. And so essentially, this discussion will then provide this framework for discussing both the current and the future health effects from climate disruption. And let me repeat that. I'll say we're trying to, climate disruption and its latest, health effects is not an issue we're trying to prevent. It's one that's here now, and it's only going to get worse. And so finally then we will talk about then the climate disruption and the actual threats to public health. Again, some of these shouldn't be too much of a surprise as far as the list, but I'm guessing some may be new to you. So starting again, just establishing a baseline. There's no question, obviously, our greenhouse gas concentrations are increasing. Our pre-industrial, just to give an idea of context of the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, were approximately 280 parts per million. And again, there are varied records that we can see this from, both recorded concentrations that are taken at the NOAA's Earth System Research Laboratory and the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. This observatory is really the kind of the go-to now for CO2 concentration observation. They've been continuously collecting data relating to atmospheric changes since about the 1950s. But we also go for even further back, up to 400,000 years ago through ice core samples. And of course, what we're seeing here, this is actually a February 2015 graph of the trends at the Mauna Loa Observatory. Again, the left part of the screen, you'll see the parts per million starting in 1950, ranging all the way, increasing to present day. And so where are we now? Latest observations here have us approaching about 400 parts per million. And to be specific, we're at 399.85 was the preliminary monthly average taken there. This is from February 4th, 2015, this year. And so again, why is that number sort of magical? I'm sure you've heard about the different numbers. Well, frankly, the aim or the goal is 350, is to keep it at 350 parts per million. And of course, we're already well past that amount. And again, some of you are familiar perhaps with the organization 350.org. Again, that's what their goal is, to grassroots organization to essentially increase awareness and try to get us up to this number. But again, we're talking about CO2 here, but there are other greenhouse gases that are actually even more potent than carbon dioxide, again, sort of a pound for pound. And so we're seeing, of course, similar increases for ones like methane and these other ones. Again, here's a chart that just talks with or references some of these other gases. We see carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and then in your lower you see methane and CFC 11 and 12. And again, those are the chlorofluorocarbons. These are the freon that DuPont made, again, refrigerants. And why, you may ask, that do we finally see sort of a leveling in CFCs? Well, we've phased them out because of the concern in the 1980s that led to the Montreal Protocol because of the hole in the ozone layer. And so here's actually, they're looking at this. They, of course, realize not only does it produce a hole in the ozone layer, but it's also a potent greenhouse gas. But from that time forward, we're already seeing those leveled out. So, of course, to sort of summarize, yeah, there's no doubt about, or little doubt about these measurements. I'll try to stay non-controversial, but candidly, I think we can say that there is no doubt here. And likewise, there's no doubt that it's primarily increased by human activities. And so one popular slide that people point to for this proposition is the carbon dioxide variations really over time. And again, you hear comments about that it's cyclical and that the ice age, that they could have been, that they were about this high, etc. But this graph, especially if you look at the small close-up in the center, you take a look at the carbon dioxide levels just since the Industrial Revolution, and certainly even compared to the ice age, you see the levels on your right that just show this dramatic increase. Again, ranging, we're up to about 400 parts per million. And so, of course, the question is, well, so what? What does this matter as far as these increases? And again, just trying to take some conservative estimates, but we're looking at about 1.4 Fahrenheit since pre-industrial times, and predictions are that we're locked into something like 2.3 increase. and with projections to the end of the century jumping up to 3.6, even 10 degrees by the end of the century with, again, this business as usual scenario. And again, of course, our efforts are to change that business as usual scenario and get us going in the other direction. And so, essentially, with this in mind, naturally, well, international panels likewise have, there's a consensus that this increase is unequivocal. Of course, the range, of course, needs to be, we just don't know. So it takes to, well, this is why, of course, we are concerned, and again, before we get to the impacts. And so, you know, how are we able as a country to address public health impacts of climate change and climate disruption? As I mentioned, we have this trigger. You know, the trigger for a regulation under the Clean Air Act, again, is rooted in public health, and specifically the Federal Clean Air Act. And so there are various provisions here in the Federal Clean Air Act that allows us to go ahead and attempt to regulate carbon dioxide. In the previous panel, there was some talk about these national ambient air quality standards, you know, which, as the name suggests, are about, you know, setting standards for pollutants in the ambient air. And although it may seem sort of far-fetched to think we could have an air quality standard for something that is naturally occurring and all over, it actually has been discussed, even within state government and air directors in the states, about whether it might be feasible to have a NAAQS standard for carbon dioxide. Because again, you know, the standard itself is set to protect public health. But the most common, or actually the first one that led to the regulation that we have now, again, to protect public health, has been focused on the mobile source provisions. And essentially, the litigation of the mobile source provisions has actually led to why we're able to regulate carbon dioxide and other GHGs for the purposes of protecting public health under the Clean Air Act. Again, I don't like to usually throw up this much in one slide, but it bears throwing up here in the sense that what we see here is a command to EPA. The administrator shall, by regulation, prescribe and from time to time revise standards for new motor vehicle engines. Again, these are new car emission standards, which, and again, the operative provisions here are which in his judgment cause or contribute to air pollution, which may be reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. And so essentially it was this litigation over this provision and these, actually some of the definitions in here, which led to the watershed case of Massachusetts versus EPA, which the Supreme Court essentially found that, analyzed some of these provisions, analyzing air pollutant, analyzes welfare, which had a reference to climate in it, to come to the conclusion that greenhouse gases are pollutants under the plain language of the Clean Air Act. And more importantly, simplifying a little bit, was that EPA must regulate unless it determines that greenhouse gases don't contribute to climate change. And so, again, that was the end result, which left EPA for a decision to actually go back and decide whether it could make such a endangerment finding, as they call it. And it certainly did. Again, in 2009, EPA came out with this endangerment finding that said in no uncertain terms, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere may reasonably be anticipated to both to endanger public health and public welfare. But note the time delay. The time it took for this to sort of percolate was about 10 years from when we started bringing this to EPA to go ahead and ask them to regulate to finally the finding. Again, stopping through both the administrative proceedings before EPA as well as the DC Court of Appeals and the US Supreme Court. Unsurprisingly, these weren't without challenges. We had both the endangerment finding, again, relating to mobile sources, as well as a tailpipe rule that actually set standards for new motor vehicles with respect to their greenhouse gas emissions, called the tailpipe rule, that was upheld in a DC Circuit case in 2012, and then went up to the US Supreme Court, again on some of the more narrow issues presented in the case, where, again, to simplify, the regulation of greenhouse gases was extended to certain stationary sources. We're talking about, different factories, different buildings that, again, produced greenhouse gases. And again, this was in last summer, and UARG versus EPA. And so essentially it has been these type of provisions, essentially, and the mobile source provisions that have kind of led to our ability here to come up with the climate change kind of standards, again, to protect public health. The final part of the Clean Air Act is something called Section 111, which is something that applies to new and existing stationary sources. And by this I mean, power plants. How are we going to regulate carbon dioxide from power plants, obviously being a pretty prime source of CO2. And again, just very briefly, there are two different approaches under 111 for new power plants and existing power plants, where we have a federal program that sets up standards for new power plants, and if they significantly modify their existing power plants, something called New Source Performance Standard, NSPS. So it's great, any power plant that's going to be going online are going to have to be, once these rules are final, take a look at their carbon emissions. And then there's a related section, 111D, a state-based program for existing sources. In other words, EPA is going off and reaching not only new sources, but existing sources. So where EPA establishes these guidelines, essentially, and it's up to states to essentially design their programs. Complicated, yes, and it's something that it's been taking quite an effort with meetings, kind of stakeholder meetings with states and interested parties for the last year or two. And EPA plans to come out with their final rules, both with respect to 111B and 111D this summer. So let's now turn, again, with this sort of background in mind. We have the tools, we have the science that is recognizing some of these, the climate change and what it's doing. And so certainly now it's a matter of addressing really the health effects and going ahead and getting a better understanding of what we can do about it. And so, simply stated, really, there's a long list of impacts from climate disruption, numerous efforts that are already underway to address them. Here in Florida, we can look to the Department of Health and its Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program, or simply the BRACE program. Again, it's working to improve the public sector's or health sector's ability to respond to health effects related to threats like hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, drought, extreme heat, and wildland fires. For my part, I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about the third National Climate Assessment, which was released in May 2014. The National Climate Assessment was produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which, as they call it, is under a legal mandate to develop this national climate assessment every 4 years. And it's divided essentially into exactly this, climate change impacts in the United States. And one chapter, of course, is devoted to human health. And again, it's comprised of a wide array of experts in the field, with George Luber from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, Kim Knowlton from the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, as these principal lead authors. But again, you can just see the number of resources that went into the development of this. And so essentially the assessment set forth the list of some of the threats to health, to human health that climate change is producing and will produce in the future. And again, a lot of these are you might be familiar with, but maybe there's some that aren't, that I'll, again, just spend a minute or two talking about here. As well as I just wanted to talk about some of the key messages that the assessment sets forward. Increased extreme weather events, wildfire, decreased air quality, heard a lot about that today. Threats to mental health, as well as illness transmitted by food, water, and disease carriers such as mosquito and ticks. And it's important to realize some of these health impacts, they're already underway here in the United States. So One thing I will pause on is this notion of threats to mental health. It's something that, again, doesn't leap to mind as a climate disruption impact. But the assessment had reported that climate disruption, such as extreme weather events, can affect mental health. Mental health problems, both short-lived and long-lasting, can increase after disasters. High levels of anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder were reported after Hurricane Katrina, for example. Wildfires, they say, may have the same effect. And again, just exposure to stress has these health impacts. Women who are pregnant, adverse birth outcomes, preterm, low birth weight, complications of birth, again, all these relating back to stress and weather events, for example. And related to this is that, some of the most vulnerable in our societies are at the most risk for these impacts. And so we have the conclusion that people of communities, especially things like children, elderly, sick, poor, and some communities of color, are adversely affected and disproportionately really affected by these impacts. Heat waves, air pollution, infectious disease, again, will affect some of these segments more severely, and certainly raises some environmental justice issues. And again, some groups like the poor often already face a high rate of some of the chronic health conditions, heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. And essentially, climate change, therefore, will amplify some of these existing health threats. Just as a general matter, some of the key assessments is that prevention provides this protection. This idea that prevention is a central tenet of public health, and our response to climate change is no different. Relatedly, early action provides the largest health benefits. They talk about a prevention being worth a pound of cure. It's the cost of addressing some of these impacts before they happen or early on will, even from an economic and a health aspect, be dramatically lower and more successful. And again, our ability to adapt in the future may be limited. In other words, it's essential that we act early. Effective communication is another thing that the assessment pointed out. As far as you think about it, effective communication is a part of prevention. The public needs to know how to assess risk themselves. I mean, we take the example of smoking. We all know smoking has health effects. Do you think people know today that health effects, that climate change has these type of health effects? They've asked Americans, and they don't conceptualize that. They'll list other things. And to the extent they're asked about health effects, they say it's something that's in the future, not that it's happening now. It'll affect me later, or it'll affect my kids later, maybe not myself. So that needs to be changed here as well. Again, just real quick, some of the concrete analyses that they did is talking about worsening asthma, for example. We have these figures here using New York as an estimate. When you think about 25.7 million Americans has asthma, it's become a problem everywhere. And certainly the heat projected increases, changing wind patterns, increased ozone is going to project it to worsen asthma. Looking at 10% or so just in Suffolk County, and again, this is a change in emergency room visits. Ragweed pollen, another one, that the season has extended to something even more than 11 to 27 days extra. Again, health effects here. Finally, projected changes in tick habitat. Although it's not uniform, we're looking, again, present all the way through 2080, a much higher establishment probability, of course, Lyme disease, and another health impacts from that. And again, I could keep going. We're talking about projected temperature, the hottest days. We all know about some of those temperature changes, and the same thing with heavy precipitation events that are also obviously leading to more climate change impacts that we'll be talking about here. Just real in conclusion, certainly threats to human health and well-being, amplifying existing health threats is something that is commonly not in the forefront of people's mind, as well as the fact that we need to get in now, required preparation, early action.
excited to talk. I just jumped right up. I have
Thank you, Professor Leske. Next up, we have Dr. Lynn Ringenberg from USF. She joined the USF faculty in 1992. Her professional career included 20 years at USF and 13 years in private practice. After receiving her undergraduate degree from the University of Nebraska, she studied biochemistry at the University of Nebraska and Maryland Schools of Medicine. She completed medical school at the University of Nebraska and her pediatric residency training at the University of Florida and Bowman Gray School of Medicine. Dr. Ringenberg's distinguished military career started in 1991, and she remained active until her retirement at the rank of colonel in 2003. She earned a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College in 2001. Dr. Ringenberg's medical interests and passions lie in medical education and healthcare for the underserved. She co-founded Physicians for Social Responsibility Tampa Bay in 2008, expanding to PSR Florida in 2012. She is the faculty advisor for the student chapter of PSR at the USF Morsani College of Medicine. PSR's work in Florida focuses primarily on environmental toxins, coal-fired power plant pollution, coal ash, climate change and health, and the medical consequences of nuclear weapons. Dr. Ringenberg is past president of PSR Florida and recently elected as president of National PSR in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Hall, for inviting me here, and a special thanks to these law student leaders that have just done a fantastic job. So let's put our hands together. My voice is a bit raspy today too, and I think it's because we talked and laughed so long last night. First, you've heard a lot about health, so I'm going to go through some of these slides a little quicker. A little bit about PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, for those who may not know this nonprofit. It's one of the oldest and only physician-led nonprofit in the country. That's a little over 50 years now old. Won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1985 for its work on, at the time they were doing a lot of atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and PSR, along with some other groups, fought that and helped with the test ban treaty in the mid-'80s. I got involved mainly because I'm kind of a late bloomer as far as activism goes, but I'm really getting pretty good, getting hot now at this age, because I have seen a serious decline in children's health. I have practiced pediatric medicine for 35 years in Florida. And during that time, I have seen a quite serious decline in children's health. And primarily that's been along with asthma, other respiratory issues. You know, back 20, 25, 30 years ago, I didn't see that many serious kids, you know, that had asthma. They were on 1 or 2 medications. I might see one every few days or a week, and now I'm seeing a half dozen a day. I'm still practicing. I still see kids in the clinic. I'm seeing a lot more kids with behavioral issues, with ADHD, soft neurologic signs, hearing loss, other things that can't be genetics, that can't be explained through genetics. So that got me into PSR and got me kind of to where I am today with this organization. Let's see if I can get this right here. So, you know, there's a lot of science out there, and you've heard a ton of it today, and the thing I want to point out really on this slide, and we'll go quickly, is back in 2009, The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, said that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. It largely went, at least in the medical community, nobody paid any attention to it. Others published some things, said some things. This year in JAMA, which is a journal of the American Medical Association, that current science highlights serious worldwide adverse health outcomes related to climate change. You know, I think health professionals are kind of gearing up a little bit, but probably not as much as I would like to see, and I'll talk about that a little bit later at the end of my talk. The National Medical Association, however, I think they're a little bit more ahead of the game as far as talking to their physicians, and this is an African American medical association. They did a survey, and you can kind of read the results of the survey, but we are seeing climate change effects on health today. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening today. And obviously most of their members felt that was right. They're seeing a large amount of increase, 80% increase in allergic symptoms in their patients. These are actively practicing physicians, more heat-related problems. And of course, it disproportionately affects those with chronic diseases, poverty, and children and older adults. And we already heard about the BRACE program, Building Resilience Against Climate Effects, which was started, and I've been on the technical advisory committee for about 3 years. And they recently came up with these 6 climate change hazards for Florida. They'll be tweaked a little differently for other parts of the country. But obviously this stuff is happening now. And Katie, you're from Miami, you know that picture there with the sea level rise. I mean, between the sea level rising and the saltwater intrusion, the things are backing up. Those things are happening now. Flooding, drought. We know that a third of the world's land surface may be at risk for extreme drought by 2100. That's not that long, and with drought comes obviously no crops, no food, no water. We can live a while without food, but we can't live very long without water. So these are real issues to public health. And there are so many threats from climate change, and this is sort of a list of categories of health. And I just don't have time to go through all of them, obviously. And you've already heard a little bit about mental health, and I'm going to talk some about some infectious diseases. But I think the thing with mental health, we're not prepared in this country to take care of mental health. We don't do a very good job right now taking care of patients, and especially children with mental health issues. It's estimated that 26% of people in the U.S. today have mental health problems, and of those, 10% suffer from mood disorders and 6% from very, very serious mental disease. And that will increase a lot with some of the climate effects that we're going to see, up to 40%, some folks say, with new mental health problems. So, the extreme weather, we've already heard about that, and the little graph shows as the seas warm, of course, the intensity of the storms get greater. Over 300,000 lives lost from extreme weather, famine, food, floods, declining air quality, etc. We've heard more about that today. But in that decade of 1990 to 2000, 66.5 children were annually have been affected by disasters around the world. And it's anywhere from traumatic injuries to mental illness to emotional illness, post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disturbance, aggressive behavior. And I see some of that in my practice after a hurricane here, or a different kind of any disaster that might affect a family. Children have more persistent psychological symptoms, so they don't get over things like adults do. And there was a disturbing study, actually. I mean, think first before I talk about that. So think Katrina. I mean, think about that. Over 1 million people displaced, and over 1,800 people died. And the pictures of Katrina should give us all goosebumps and a little nausea. And we learned a lot, I hope, from that incident. But those children had prolonged, and a recent study in the Journal of Pediatrics, that some kids are still having emotional and mental problems from what they went through, what they saw at Katrina. Children who feel they're growing up in a threatened future tend to be much more troubled than their parents or their grandparents. And there's a recent survey in Australia that I find really kind of disturbing, that children indicated that a quarter of the kids that were interviewed fear that the world will end before they grow up. And that's not what childhood is about. And so flooding, the graph on top really shows 50 years of, from the 1950 to 2000, the increase in flooding that we're seeing across the globe. And floods are among the deadliest of all weather-related hazards. In the US alone, about 100 people die a year from floods. It's a terrible public health issue because you not only have the trauma that's involved with floods, but you have a lot of vector and waterborne infections, foodborne diseases, respiratory, allergic, trauma, drowning, mental illness, displacement, population displacement. So we'll talk a little bit about some vector-borne diseases. Vectors are receptacles. The receptacle is the mosquito in most cases, a mosquito or tick or flea. And of course malaria. 500,000 folks are ill a year around the world. Most of it, as you see there, 91% of malarial deaths are in the African region. That's second only to HIV. Those are 2012 statistics. And you can see the red part in the map showing by 2080, which isn't that far away, that they project malaria being indigenous in the United States. So the mosquitoes will be there carrying the malarial disease. We average around 1,500 cases of malaria a year in this country, but they're brought into the country. We have no indigenous malaria that I'm aware of. I've seen a few pregnant women with malaria in our practice in Tampa and their babies. Dengue fever. The United States is becoming much more vulnerable to dengue. It's not like we're seeing dengue all over the place, but after 75 years of absence of dengue fever in Miami, it's now there and it's indigenous, so it's not people coming back from Puerto Rico where it is endemic, as is chikungunya, which is endemic in Puerto Rico. I saw my first case of chikungunya, and I said, I've been practicing for 35 years, and it was a kid that came back from Puerto Rico. And so we're going to start seeing more of that. And so we have to start educating the public and educating our residents and our fellows about these things. And obviously it's a lot of cases of dengue and deaths. And again, those are mostly in children. And this particular little mosquito here, that tiger mosquito, he's a nasty little booger because he likes to bite all the time. He's just not one of those sunrise and sunset guys. He's biting all day. And so that's a concern. We'll have to change the way we think about putting on our long sleeves, etc., and preventing ourselves from getting mosquito bites. Lyme disease, you all know about. It's spread rapidly in the country. Matter of fact, the National Institutes of Health just recently came out with a new report, an article that they think that we've been unreporting Lyme disease significantly in the country, and it's probably almost more like a virulent epidemic because they say that we're probably seeing between 300 and 1 million cases of Lyme disease in the country, often not diagnosed, often not reported. The tick, how small it is. If you ever go out camping and a week or 2 or 3 later you come and you have that little target lesion on your skin, you have Lyme disease until proven otherwise. So that's a good thing to know. 80% of patients have the target lesion. Some don't get medical care because they don't think much about it. West Nile has spread rapidly in this country. It started back in '99 up in New York, and you can just see, and this just goes to 2005, but it has spread pretty much, it's in every state in the country now. And we have a lot of areas that have West Nile virus activity. That's a little green map with all those little dots. That doesn't mean there's disease there, but there's the mosquito and there's the potential for West Nile virus. The mosquitoes now with climate change, they have a longer breeding season. They're going to have a shorter time to mature. The virus is multiplying much faster now because of the warmth, and the humidity stimulates the mosquitoes to bite more and to breed more. So what a life they have. Waterborne infections, again, from our rainfall, our flooding, our sea level rise, high temperatures, and drought. So that's just a perfect combination for cholera, crypto, hepatitis, giardia. We see all of those now. We're seeing more of it now. Norovirus, of course, contaminated food and water. You hear a lot about that one. It's the most common cause of acute gastroenteritis in the United States. About 21 million illnesses a year, 70,000 people end up in the hospital, and 600 deaths. It's very contagious. You get it often on cruise ships. The other one that's really a very, very ugly parasite is Naegleria. You've all read stories, heard about it, I'm sure. The one that's the brain-eating amoeba, and literally that's what it does. It gets into the nose and up through the nasal cribinates here in the nose and gets into the brain and literally causes an infection, inflammation. We're seeing more of it now further north. Minnesota, I think, was the last case that I read about. But as our lakes warm and this amoeba becomes more active, we'll see more of that disease. We've talked a little about thermal stress already. In this decade of 99 to 09, we had 7,800 deaths in the United States from extreme heat. Those are normally older people and children. Also a lot of increase in cardiovascular, respiratory, and cerebral vascular hospital admissions. Many, many deaths in Europe during 2003 and 2010. Obviously the risks there. And this is where public health is really important. You have to know where your homeless are, they're at risk, where your socially isolated patients are. People that are on blood pressure medication and psych medication don't thermoregulate as well, so they're more susceptible to the stress of heat waves. We've talked a lot today about ambient air pollution. Just a couple things I'd like to add to it is over 25 million children today live in counties that violate the national air quality standards, and I think somebody mentioned early, my county is one of those, and that's Hillsborough County. 35 million of our kids live within 30 miles of a power plant, coal-fired power plant, with an estimated 2 million of these kids with asthma. This data is, I think, from 2010, if I recall. 72,000 of our schools in the country are within 30 miles of a power plant. We've already talked about the other things there as far as affecting the growth of lungs and premature babies. And to add insult to injury with all this, the health system doesn't have the capacity to take care of the number of patients that we're going to see. There's the supply and there's the demand going up, and obviously we need to have a correction there. The number of beds have dropped from the mid-70s, 1.4 million, down to less than 1 million. So those are things that public health is going to have to pay some attention to. I really do think that the Clean Power Plan, although it's not perfect, but it's a start, I think it's offering us the most health protective regulation that we've had for human health in decades. We've already talked about some of these things. I think the co-benefits, and there's an excellent article that recently came out of a group of scientists from Syracuse, Harvard, and Boston, and Jonathan Levy was the lead author on that the co-benefits from decreasing carbon emissions per the Clean Power Plan, we're going to see kind of near-term things that are really going to improve health like right now, and then hopefully long-term will be helping change, bring down the CO2 for the world. But the co-benefits by 2020, and man, that's not very far away. 35 less premature deaths each year, 1,000 less hospital admissions from heart and lung disease, this is per year, 220 less heart attacks prevented per year. And then there's lots of statistics on how, the asthma and other benefits, especially to children and the elderly and vulnerable populations. So I think that really is a nice start. And like I said, it's not a perfect plan, but it's a place to start, and it's getting people talking about this, and that's probably one of the most important things. And we do need to stop smoking coal. We need to, we're still trying to work on getting folks off cigarettes. We heard about that today a little bit, and secondary smoke and its effects on health, but we need to get off of fossil fuels and just leave it in the ground. And something that we've just started at PSR is called Climate Health Action Teams. And what we're trying to do, they're called chats, and we welcome everybody here to join a chat. We formed them across the country, and they're not just for doctors or health professionals, they're for anybody who's interested in working on improving health. So the chats they have attorneys on them, they have moms, they have teachers, they have doctors and nurses and other health professionals. So anybody can be on a chat. And the main thing is to educate and advocate, and that's what PSR has done for all these years. We educate. We're not a lobby group. We're not a 501c4. We're a 3. But we want to get out now and talk. We want to write op-eds. We want to talk to our colleagues. We want to talk to editors and churches and anybody we can talk to about the health effects that we're seeing from climate change. So that's our new logo, Healthy Energy, Healthy People, that we're using in Florida. It's not being used at the national, so you won't see it on the national website, but you'll see it on the Florida website. And the only other thing in closing, is, you know, I would imagine that everybody in this room is a mom, a dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, or at a minimum, you know a kid. And I think that that's why we have to do this. For that little baby sitting by his dad on the beach, because kids right now are 33% of our population on the globe, but they're 100% of the future of this world. So that's why it really behooves all of us to really become activists, okay? Even if young or old, it's time to stand up and let's protect health. So thank you very much.